if you're anywhere near Medford, Somerville. We're really excited to welcome Professor Jeffrey Pugh and hear about his new book, The Invisibility Bargain, Governance Networks and Migrant Human Security. Professor Pugh is an assistant professor in the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the founding executive director of the Center for Mediation, Peace, and Resolution of Conflict in Quito, Ecuador. He's here to talk about his new book, which explores the networks of state and non-state actors that simultaneously provide migrants with resources and protection in their host countries while helping to keep them politically visible out of fear of a backlash. He's going to tell us more about the book, like I said, as well as his other research, and then we'll launch into a Q&A. So Professor Pugh, take it away.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you also, Sophia, and to both of you for setting this up, and for the group here, thanks for coming. This is, as the folks said, a dreary day looking outside, and with snow still out there if you are here in the sort of greater Boston, Cambridge area. So we'll try and keep it warm and toasty here on Zoom. So I'm gonna share my screen. I'll try to be more or less paying attention to time with a relatively small group. I think we'll have a good chance for interaction at the end. And I would invite you, if there are questions about things about this particular project, I'm happy to go in more depth. It's hard to summarize an almost 300-page book in just a short talk. So I've only picked and chosen a few bits to talk about today. And also, I have a lot of experience as a conflict resolution practitioner in Ecuador and elsewhere. So some of the kind of practical implications of this research, we could talk about it as well. So I'm happy to do any of that in Q&A that folks are interested in. So to get us started, I'm going to share my screen here. And I actually like it when I can do this and sort of see where I am, but it looks kind of messy. So I guess I'll share the full screen. So this, my focus today is to talk about this book, The Invisibility Bargain, Governance Networks and Migrant Human Security. And to put this into context, this is a project that began on a June day in 2005. So I was in Ibarra, Ecuador, which is a town kind of halfway between the capital city of Quito and the northern border with Colombia. And I was helping to facilitate a series of dialogues between Colombian and Ecuadorian women. And the idea was there was xenophobia, there were sort of stigmatized images of each other. And we wanted to create a forum where they could talk to each other, overcome some of those stereotypes. And over the course of a week, others from the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, UNIFEM, a therapy center, and my NGO, the logo here in the bottom right is for SIMPROC, which is the organization I founded almost 20 years ago in Ecuador. We helped to facilitate this dialogue, and it really got me thinking and wondering, why do people develop conflicts around migration? Why does xenophobia happen? Why do people resist when others come to their country for the first time? And so that launched this agenda that has been continuing over the past few years. So the big questions that the book takes on and that I'm gonna focus on today are: how do international organizations, NGOs, and the state contribute to peace and human security among migrants and citizens? And so this is very explicitly not just a state-centric approach. And in fact, that's one of my critiques of the literature, is it often focuses on the global north and ignores a lot of the factors of migrants coming to the global south, despite the fact that almost half of the migrants in the world go to the global south, and about 86% of the refugees in the world go to the global south. So there's a story that's not told very well about what happens when they get there. How do they navigate integration, protection, etc., in a context that often has less capacity than developed countries. The second piece is, what role do governance networks that link these institutions together play in increasing human security, or in some cases not, beyond what the state can do alone? And so you'll see throughout today that I'm arguing against a strong state model. To let me say what I mean. A lot of times the default setting is, if you want to be more secure, if you want to stop immigration from representing a threat, you need a strong state with high capacity to enforce laws, to build big border walls, maybe familiar phrases after the last few years here in the US. So a strong state allows you to have greater control over the border and over foreigners, and as a result, the good citizens will enjoy peace and stability. That's kind of a default assumption in the national security literature. The problem is, it assumes that the source of the threat is foreign, and the referent needing protection is citizens, and everyone who lives in the country needs protection, right? And everyone benefits from it. If you have some people who are living on the margins, who are excluded from protection, that actually creates sort of gray zones where insecurity can fester. And so we all have an interest in everybody enjoying a sort of basic level of human security. And often the migrants coming into a country are sources of contributions, have economic contributions, cultural diversity, etc. So I am arguing that actually a strong state may have incentives, in a democracy at least, to scapegoat foreigners, to not protect them. In a lot of countries, migrants don't vote, whereas native citizens do. And so the state has perverse incentives not to be a provider of security in those cases. And so it may be the non-state actors play a more important role. So that's the kind of underlying logic here. Today, I'm going to introduce my core concept, which I call the Invisibility Bargain, and sort of draw out the argument that comes from it. I'm going to talk about, particularly my main case is Colombian forced migrants in Ecuador. And then I'll talk about the social integration, political activism, and what it means for our understanding of peace and human security. So in most receiving countries of migrants, there is a set of unwritten expectations on the part of the host community towards migrants. These aren't usually written down as laws, but everybody kind of understands them. And it's a basic trade. The host community agrees to accept, or at least tolerate, not actively persecute and deport migrants when they fulfill certain expectations that the host state has for them. One of those is that they have to be perceived to be contributing something of value to the host state. That could be an economic contribution. You hear in the US sometimes that migrants are a source of labor to do certain jobs that would have scarcities if they didn't do them. In other places, they bring certain skills, other kinds of contributions. So mostly here, I'm talking about economic contribution, although it could also be something like military service, or being involved in caring professions that keep everybody safe. And the other two expectations are that migrants remain invisible socially and politically. By social invisibility, I mean that they are not expressing religious, cultural, linguistic, racial, and other differences visibly in public that would set them apart, that would show that they are rejecting some aspect of the host society's culture in ways that is seen as important. And then political invisibility is the idea that they're not demanding their rights or making overt demands on the state. And so they're kind of expected to be present, but not seen nor heard. And when that happens, they're allowed to stay. But it really creates a precarious situation. So in the context of this invisibility bargain, I mentioned states are primarily accountable to citizens who vote and often don't respond as readily to migrants who don't vote. As a result, there are gaps in the formal security protection. There may be protections in the law or formal institutions. In Ecuador, it's quite a progressive country if you look at the laws. The Constitution guarantees basic rights for refugees, especially almost the same ones as for Ecuadorians. It says no human is illegal. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of migratory status, etc. But because of this sort of informal set of expectations, often migrants don't experience that protection in practice, and they're blocked from accessing it. As a result, non-state actors began to fill in those gaps. Take the church, for example, the UN High Commission on Refugees, informal networks at a neighborhood level. These kinds of groups take on roles as brokers, helping to negotiate protections for migrants, help responding and listening to migrants, and then articulating those demands to the state so that the migrant doesn't have to do it directly. Because as I mentioned before, when the migrant goes out and protests in the street, that creates a very strong backlash from the host society. They're breaking this deal, this invisibility bargain, and it results in a lot of persecution frequently. So when you have protection through network like this, there's greater human security combined with less backlash from the host population. So what I'm trying to explain is kind of protection, human security. I think this group probably is pretty familiar with the idea of human security, the idea that you're taking the individual as the object of protection, and it could be whatever kind of threat, not just foreign military threats trying to invade the state. I break it down into these kind of big chunks that rights, recognition, resources, and protection are what you want. If you have those things, have access to them, you have greater human security than if you don't. So in order to try to examine these questions, I did a lot of field work with a Fulbright and a number of other sources of support over the course of about 10 years in Ecuador, a total of about 15 months of field work spread over that time. I conducted 170 interviews with migrants themselves, with organizations that work with them, with people in the state, people in the UN system, et cetera. And then I conducted a survey of migrants. About 95% of the migrants in my sample are Colombian. So Ecuador was during this time period the largest recipient of refugees and asylum seekers in the Americas. So not everyone recognizes how big a role it played in that. And almost all of those were people fleeing the violence in Colombia. Now with the new Venezuelan flow, those dynamics are changing some. But here on the map, you see little pins and you see some black arrows at the main border crossings from Colombia into Ecuador. And so I did nearly 700 surveys spread across these 6 provinces in the border region with Ecuador or with Colombia. And these are the main places where Colombians live coming into the country. Both in the Andes Mountains here along the middle, along the Pan American Highway in Tulcan, Ibarra, Quito, and Santo Domingo, on the coast in Esmeraldas, and in the Amazon jungle here in Lago Agrio, which is also called Nueva Loja. So from that, I was able to analyze the surveys, do a lot of sort of qualitative analysis from the interviews. I also did some network analysis, trying to figure out how the relationships between different institutions actually play an important role. And I also, I don't think I'll have time to say much about it today unless you have questions, but did some discourse analysis. So I traced how the way people talk about migration changed over time, analyzing 400 speeches by the Ecuadorian president about migration and over 800 newspaper articles over 10 years, and sort of did some analysis of how those discourses changed. In Ecuador, the number of refugees coming in has varied over time, and the response by the state has also varied over time. So this shows you the big picture from 2000, when Plan Colombia, which was a US military aid package to Colombia, resulted in the Colombian state going out and fighting harder against the FARC. And as a result, the number of people displaced increased dramatically. They crossed the border to Ecuador, the nearest border country that would let them in. And so that's kind of where the numbers started. And you can see that throughout the early part of the 2000s, the numbers increased fairly dramatically. The small dotted line is the number of asylum seekers, and that increased over these years. The dashed line is the acceptance rate. So that is the percentage of asylum seekers who asked for protection, and the number that were awarded refugee status by the state. And so these numbers increased over time. In this first phase, the state didn't have much capacity to deal with it. So the UN High Commission on Refugees, and especially the church, the Catholic Church, were some of the early folks really figuring out how to deal with this flow. With the election of Rafael Correa in 2006 and 7, the state began to play a more active role, building its capacity, and especially in coordination with the UN High Commission on Refugees. So they built much stronger partnerships and invested in increasing their protections. So this big spike is from a one-year initiative between the UN High Commission on Refugees and the Ecuadorian state to double the number of registered refugees, which they did. So that was a real high mark for protection. At the same time, I think that it made the problem more visible, and going into an election cycle that was coming in 2013, I think that was costly to the state, and is another reason why you see a dramatic downturn after this. The state began to feel electoral pressure. The opposition candidates began to say, you're handing out refugee status to all these criminals and terrorists and not protecting our own people. And so the state began, it didn't abandon the progressive rhetoric. It still talked about universal citizenship and migration, but the practice of protection was sort of hollowed out. And so that's why this line, the dashed line here is pretty important to look at, that between 2014 and 2017, the acceptance rate for refugees was somewhere around 4%. So the state just stopped giving refugee status essentially during this period. And instead, they tried to convince people to use other forms of visas, especially the Mercosur visa, which allowed them to be in the country, but didn't give them the kind of international law protections that refugee status allows. It kept it in the discretion of the state whether to deport them at any time. They also hid this information. During this time period, I was actively asking the state what its acceptance rate was on at least 4 different times in different provinces. And each time they either evaded the question and gave me an answer to something I didn't ask, or just said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that, or gave me an answer that wasn't true. So they didn't publish these statistics until last year, when a new president was in office. So it sort of shows you that the state was trying to evade the idea of protection without showing that that's what it was doing. Whoops. So I wanted to tell you kind of some examples of what I mean by social invisibility. This idea that refugees have, and migrants have to blend in, have to try to minimize their visible and audible differences. For Colombians in Ecuador, it's mostly their accent. They look pretty similar to Ecuadorians. You can't always tell who's who, but their accent is usually discernible. So one woman who was in Quito, an asylum seeker, said, "I stopped selling empanadas in the street because I'm afraid. The migration police would often come by, and if they hear a Colombian accent, they would ask to see our documents. The photocopy of my asylum seeker document that I carry serves very little use. They often claim that these documents are fake and detain Colombians anyway. When I go out, I try to keep my mouth shut." And so she's saying that one of the coping mechanisms, survival strategies, is just to not go out and mingle with Ecuadorians, especially when the state is present, because that keeps you safe. It can increase your risk if people can tell that you're a foreigner. You can think about that in the US, the examples you may have heard where people speaking Spanish or Korean or something in a Walmart get accosted by some random person saying, "Hey, speak American." You see similar dynamics in lots of receiving countries. So that was one of the things that migrants did to respond to this invisibility expectation, was sort of reducing their interaction with others. But in my survey, I asked the Colombians I was surveying, do you interact with Ecuadorians? And if so, how often, what's the frequency, and in what kind of places? So is it superficial contact in the street, the market, or is it, in the family, the workplace, sports in your neighborhood, etc.? And the pattern that I found, and if anyone has studied conflict resolution, you've probably heard of contact theory at some point. This is strong evidence for it, that those who had had no interaction with Ecuadorians had mostly negative perceptions of them, over 70%. Almost none had positive perceptions. Those who had meaningful interaction, meaning they interacted with the host state folks in their neighborhoods, their workplace, school, family, etc., over half had a positive perception, and less than 20% had a negative perception. What's kind of interesting, though, is casual interaction. You're around them, but you're not really engaging in a meaningful way, did not have this sort of positive effect. It basically just reduced the number who had no opinion. Whatever you already thought about migrants, you kind of locked into that. And that's consistent with the what we know about contact already. So the paradox here is that people were responding to the social invisibility pressures by withdrawing and not interacting with the other side. But we know that those who did interact with the other side had better outcomes. They had better coexistence with the other group. And I'll show you maybe in a little bit that also gave them access to networks that they wouldn't otherwise have. Their Ecuadorian friends became the people who introduced them to resources that they need. They helped them find a job. They could vouch for them when they were trying to rent an apartment. And so there was this really kind of a perverse effect that the very thing that would help you is something you are not doing because you're trying to protect yourself against backlash. On the political side, there was a strong sense that refugees should not get involved in politics, by which it was sort of interpreted they shouldn't make overt demands on the state. It's kind of like when you have a guest come into your home. If they come in and put their feet up on your coffee table and say, "Hey, I don't like that TV channel, you should change it," that's sort of seen as presumptuous, or who are they? This is my house. And that same sort of logic is applied by a number of folks in the host community who say that that migrants, including refugees, should remain politically invisible. So this is a quote from a local official in the coastal region who said, "Colombians have started getting involved in politics because they're smart and well prepared. Not too long ago, One even ran for prefect of Esmeraldas, despite being in this country for only 5 years or so. I think they're ungrateful, coming to our country, being welcomed, and then taking over. We as Ecuadorians are the ones who have the right to decide how we will be governed. And so there was a sort of logic of gratitude of, we gave you protection. Who are you to ask for kind of basic rights or articulate what your needs are? And so that's part of the mechanism behind the backlash. Migrants understood this phenomenon quite plainly. And I asked them, what are some of the things that you either have done, could imagine doing, or would never do to sort of improve your situation? Essentially, what are your political strategies? And so the things that they said they either could imagine doing or had done were mostly individual things. They contacted the UN High Commission on Refugees. They would maybe contact the police or those sorts of things. The things they would never do were participate in a public protest or an information campaign, things that involve collective action. But then I asked them this question, which you see the responses of the things that you did, which ones worked? And so you see that the things that worked were those that involved informal interactions, not interacting with the state. The things that worked least were asking the state for help, whether individually, like contacting the police, or as a group, like going out and protesting in the street. Whereas negotiating informally with your local power brokers in your neighborhood, being a part of an information campaign that you don't have to go out and show yourself, those kinds of things people said they worked. I'll give you an example of the backlash that came. So in 2019, there were a group of Afro-Colombians who were waiting on a response about third country resettlement. They wanted to be resettled to another country by the UN High Commission on Refugees, and they had not yet gotten that answer. And so they built a little camp right in front of the UNHCR office in Quito and held up signs, and they got media attention. This was a very visible protest targeting the UNHCR, but since it's actually the Ecuadorian state who makes decisions about refugees, it was also sort of targeting the state. And the response was not great. The coverage in the media portrayed them as these sort of rabble-rousing, ungrateful people at best, and probably linked with drug dealers and terrorists at worst. And at one point, you see in the top right picture here, the police just came and completely surrounded it, cleared the whole place, and sort of drove them away. So there was a fairly negative reaction to this, and they didn't get what they were asking for. So this is a sort of typical claim-making strategy. In contrast, my argument is that when migrants went through networks, they tried to access protection by going to people they knew already. If they were going to the UN High Commission on Refugees or their local church or an association of Colombians, they could ask for help. They could learn information that's useful. And those relationships became a kind of social capital that gave them access to a much wider set of resources. The person they went to that they already trusted may not have what they needed, but that person might have relationships with, for example, the state or the UNHCR, and could refer them or direct them or even walk with them to that other agency and sort of open up the protection in the network to them. And trust makes a big difference here. Migrants overall don't trust the state often. I asked migrants how much trust they had in a whole range of different institutions. And you can see here, this is those that said they trusted a lot, a little, or none. And the little dotted line that kind of goes down is those who said they trusted a lot as a percentage of those who were aware that the institution existed at all. Overall, the more aware they were that a non-state institution existed, the more they trusted it. For state institutions, it was the reverse. The more they were aware it existed, the less they trusted it. For example, the courts, the police, the Colombian government. So I've highlighted in yellow the state institutions, and you can see that overall they have much lower levels of trust compared to non-state institutions. The key actors in the network that I'm identifying are the Ecuadorian state, the UN High Commission on Refugees, and the Catholic Church. So each of these has a set of a mandate, a lot of power and influence, and different sorts of incentives and goals that they have as their mission. So it's not that state is bad, NGOs are good. That's not actually the story I'm trying to tell you. It's when the state, the UN, and the church and other NGOs coordinate with each other and have a network that includes all of them, that's a diverse network. And so the downside of each of those institutions is kind of compensated. That if someone goes to the state first and is pushed away, they have someone else to go to. They could go first to the church, and then the church might issue a sort of a referral form that helps them get access to the state more easily. Again, migrants understand these dynamics, and just as a quick example of the way that it really has an impact on security, I asked them, have you been the victim of a violent crime or not? And for those who had, I asked, well, what did you do after that happened? And the most common response of migrants after being the victim of a violent crime was to do nothing at all. They didn't expect they would find help if they called the police. Less than a third of the respondents went to the police for help. And so it's really important to think about this entire network that they could go to for help, because they didn't perceive that they had access to that by going directly to the state. So there are a number of different pathways that they can have access to different kinds of rights, resources, recognition, and protection. And I won't talk about most of them. I will instead go to a little bit of a comparison just to show you the impact of this. So the strong state people that I mentioned at the very first I was arguing against would say, migrants and there's going to be better security in places where the state is more present because it can offer more control. Presumably more money would help because then you have less crime and things like that. And so I show you here that in Quito, it's a richer area. Migrants overall are doing better. Less than half of them are earning less than $2 a day, compared to, for example, Lago Agrio, where 70% of the migrants are earning less than $2 a day. In Lago Agrio is certainly much poorer than Quito. So that approach would expect you'd see better security in Quito than you would in Lago Agrio. What I did was ask migrants, have you received help from anyone since coming to Ecuador? If so, list the organizations you've received help from. And then I showed the connections between those organizations. Basically, if the same migrant reported receiving help from two different organizations, that meant they had a shared beneficiary. They were kind of connected and coordinated. And so this graph shows the connections between the organizations that migrants mentioned. And in Quito, you can see that there's a number of organizations. If you knew what these organizations were, you would know not many of them are from the state. Up here, the Ministry of Foreign Relations is the only state agency that appears on this graph, despite it being the center of political power. And so migrants weren't feeling like they were getting help from that. The UN High Commission on Refugees, Scalabrini, which is a church, a Catholic order, these are the places that seem to have more influence. Now compare this with Lago Agrio. You can already see a difference, right? Lago Agrio, there is much stronger connection between the organizations. It's a smaller town. You can walk to most of these, and they coordinate on a weekly basis. They have a round table where the different representatives of the organizations meet together. It's also more diverse. So there's several state agencies, church, NGOs, informal groups like migrant organizations, and Esmeralda's on the coast, much less integrated and coordinated. So that's a very not dense network. And the results are here, that in Lago Agrio, fewer people reported discrimination than in Quito. Fewer people reported being the victim of violent crime than in Quito. So unlike the expectation from the strong state people, being poorer or having less state presence did not result in worse outcomes for human security, but actually better, because there was a more dense and more diverse network among these organizations in the governance network there. Quito, there was a less dense and less diverse network. So I think that this one last example I'll give, and then I'll move to close it up, because I want to make sure there's time for some questions and stuff. There was a family that came to Quito, a Colombian family, and they were looking for protection because they had been threatened by a certain paramilitary group in Colombia. And so they were coming to Quito. They made contact with a group of Colombian migrant association. So it was led by other Colombian refugees who had fled and had established this group to help their compatriots. And that group was connected with an Ecuadorian legal aid clinic that served refugees. It helped them prepare their case before going for the Ministry of Foreign Relations. And so this family came, and the migrant organization helped them set up, find housing and get set up. And then a little while later, the Colombian Association and the Ecuadorian Legal Aid Clinic received a letter from the paramilitary group putting them on the target list and threatening them and threatening the family, saying, we know that they're there and they're now a military target. Now, if the family was dealing with that on their own, they would have few recourses, right? They likely wouldn't get a receptive audience from the police, from the state. However, since they had entered the governance network through these other organizations, particularly the legal aid clinic was well connected. It had connections with the police, with the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, and the Ministry of Foreign Relations. And they were able to activate those contacts so that UN High Commissioner on Refugees arranged for protective hiding of both the family and the migrant association leaders in a different part of Ecuador. And they filed a statement, a complaint, before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So that sort of protective apparatus was made available to this family because the network opened it up. It would not have been available had they gone straight to the state and say, please help. So this indirect access to protection and human security is really important when we're looking at areas of the world where what is written on paper as the law and as the formal institutions may not explain very well what people experience on the ground. So the Invisibility Bargain gives us a framework for understanding the choices, the dilemmas that face migrants, and also for understanding the way they innovate, the adaptations that they create in order to have a say in how they're governed, in order to cope and survive and thrive without activating a xenophobic backlash from the host community. So hopefully that provides a helpful framework that even if you're not particularly interested in Ecuador, you could apply in other kind of receiving countries. So I'll stop there. For those who are interested in learning more about this, there's a whole book you can read. It's on Amazon or the Oxford Press. If you are interested in the book, you can take note of this code that can get you a discount if you go through Oxford Press. So I think, let's see, I'm gonna stop the share and open up for any sort of questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was very interesting, and it was great to see some of the specific questions as well that you asked in your surveys, which gave us a lot of great insight. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or just put them in the chat if you're more comfortable, and Gabby or I can read those out loud. While people are thinking and formulating their thoughts, I guess I can start with a question about just like in your research of these more informal brokerages of security, particularly these informal networks, what were some of the challenges that you faced in measuring that kind of data, and how did you overcome that?
Yeah, so one of my big strategies as a researcher of mixed methods is triangulation, recognizing that no one method is going to be perfect. And so one of the challenges for figuring out those networks through survey research is I accessed the migrants themselves already through networks, right? For both security and ethical reasons, I did not want to just go randomly into neighborhoods knocking on people's doors saying, hey, I'm here to ask you about your refugee status. That tends to make people really nervous. And so in order to build trust, in order to access folks in a way that was safe for them as well as for me and not scare them, I tended to access them through organizations that already had pre-existing relationships with them. Often it was a group that would come and meet with an organization and agreed to take the survey. I tried to sort of balance that by going with some of the folks from the communities where these people lived and get some surveys directly in the neighborhoods introduced by kind of their neighbors. But it's hard to make definitive judgments about the structure of the network when some of it reproduces the networks I used to access them in the first place. The way I tried to get around that some was having a starting point, a list of organizations that served migrants that did not rely on those networks. It was a comprehensive list that we assembled over a period of a year or so with over 100 organizations in different parts of the country. And so I at least did my initial outreach to these various organizations, not relying on their networks with each other to do the initial invitation. So that was part of one of the challenges. And then what you can do is do qualitative interviews. You can ask people about their experiences, how they navigated those networks. And the book really brings out those kind of rich stories of how sometimes it was kind of by the seat of the pants, right? Organizations said, you know, we want to do this thing that we think would make people better off, but we don't have the resources to do it. So who else at the table here could pitch in? And they called it protection by Mingo. In the Andes, there's a indigenous tradition of the Mingo, which is kind of like a barn raising. It's a community work day that relies on reciprocity. If there's something like fixing a road or even, you know, building a big wall in a neighbor's house, something that the person can't do by themselves, they call a Mingo, which is everyone in the community comes, pitches in and helps to do the thing. And then they all celebrate afterwards. And then the next time when they call a Mingo, you better be there and pitching into their project. So it relies on reciprocity. And that same logic gets used by these organizations as a way of accomplishing things that they don't have the resources to do on their own. And the sort of side benefit is it also brings in different kinds of organizations that have different missions, different assets, and different levels of trust. And that can be really useful. So the interviews help to expose those causal pathways that I wouldn't get from the survey, whereas the survey gave the big picture of allowing me to see what the structure is like in each of the localities.
Great, thank you so much. Does anyone else have a question?
I do. So I actually am super fascinated. I know you didn't talk about it a lot in the in your talk, but the discourse analysis that you mentioned, because I think it's public narratives and discussions are so influential to like on the ground realities, and vice versa. So I would love to hear more about what you found in changes in the discourse, and what you think may have caused any of the changes that you found.
Okay, great question, and thanks, because that's one of my favorite things to talk about. And is actually, I'm writing a couple of separate articles about that. One is already published that looks at President Correa's speeches over time, it's on universal citizenship, that was published in Latin American Politics and Society. And another one that's under review now looks at the newspaper discourses. So let me actually share again to show you some of what I did with that. One of the things that was really interesting to me is how throughout Correa's term, the state took on more and more of a role, right? Before they had been kind of overwhelmed and playing second fiddle to the church and to the UNHCR, whereas Correa said, no, we want the state to be in charge, which is a good thing, but it also meant that he wanted to control who to give protection to, and that was often politicized. So as he felt electoral pressure, he sort of stripped out protections. And I wanted to know if that was reflected, if there was any evidence of that happening in the discourse as well. So the graphs you see here are a coding of the 800 plus newspaper articles about migration that I have in my database over about 8 years. And I wanted to know, did just the mention of ACNUR, which is the UN High Commission on Refugees, change over time versus the mention of government agencies? And I have a whole series of words that would appear that would be an indication of the government. And in this top graph, you see that that did happen over this time period, that the UNHCR became more silent. It was not mentioned as a relevant actor as often over time, whereas elements of the state gradually started to increase. The language people used also changed. Over time, here in the bottom left, the word refugee was used much less often in newspaper articles and stuff. So it declined fairly dramatically between 2012 and 2017. Whereas I mentioned before, Correa didn't want to abandon his reputation of sort of a progressive protector of the downtrodden, 21st century socialism against the militarized Colombian and their US stooge allies. So he wanted to maintain this language of universal citizenship, especially because Ecuadorians were also immigrants with an E. They had left Ecuador to go to Spain, Italy, and the US in large numbers in about the same time period, and they voted for him in larger numbers than Ecuadorians in Ecuador did. In fact, it was his idea to give the vote to Ecuadorians abroad. And so he had an electoral and financial incentive because of the remittances to say, you know, everywhere we should protect immigrants. He really mostly had the incentives to protect that for Ecuadorians abroad, but he wanted the consistency of saying it for everyone. But what he did was introduce a new language of human mobility. So refugee is very specific. It's only those people who are fleeing, you know, violence based on these certain criteria, which are mainly Colombians and are mainly not Ecuadorians. Whereas human mobility lumps those people together with economic immigrants, with returned Ecuadorian immigrants, coming back home, all of that is lumped together in human mobility. And so he could maintain what sound like a consistent narrative of progressive protection, but really mostly have policies in place that helped the Ecuadorians abroad or the returned immigrants, and stripped out the protections for refugees over time. And so you can see here the mention of that phrase, human mobility, increases significantly over time. So these are some of the kinds of things that you can do by looking systematically at the words that are used in public discourse and the media. Just to give you a little bit of a snapshot about what this sounds like when you actually hear Correa say it. This was a phrase that was in a speech that he gave right around the time of his shift. 2012 was when he was responding to this pressure from his political opponents, stop opening the floodgates to all these terrorists and drug dealers and foreigners, you should protect Ecuadorians, etc. And he said, it's absurd to claim that because of our policy of free human mobility and planetary citizenship, insecurity has increased. However, we're doing a very careful study to see if there is any relationship between the entrance of citizens of certain countries and the increase in insecurity. If this hypothesis is verified, you can rest assured that we'll make any changes and take any measures that are necessary. We have our priorities clearly in mind, and the primary one is the welfare and security of the Ecuadorian people. We cannot fall into romanticism. I repeat, if it's necessary to harden our immigration policy, that is what we will do. So he's trying to, on the one hand, say, no, open borders isn't making insecurity happen. And on the other, well, if it is, we're going to prioritize Ecuadorians and screw over the migrants. And so there was this sort of ambivalent discourse that began to emerge in these middle years. And in fact, that is what he did. In 2012, he issued Decreto 1182, which hardened immigration policy a lot, and actually said you have to claim refugee status within the first 15 days of coming into the country. If you don't, that ship has sailed and you aren't eligible. You're an undocumented immigrant at that point, which is, goes against most human rights sort of protections, given that you might not even know that you needed this or know where you could ask for that status within the first 15 days. By the way, that part was eventually struck down by the Constitutional Court through the advocacy of non-state organizations. So you see this kind of ambivalence on the part of the state coming through in the rhetoric, as reflected here in both the speeches and the media.
Thank you. So we just have a couple minutes left. We're getting to the end here, and then I know people have classes pretty soon. We have a strange schedule today since we had off yesterday. So everything's like packed very tightly. But Professor, if you have any closing words or anything that we haven't covered yet that you'd like to add, and then I guess the rest will be for you all to go and read in the book.
Okay. I guess I'll signal to the practical implications here. So it's one thing to say this is new knowledge that we can contribute and bring to our understanding of migrant integration. But what do you do practically with that? And so I see my role as a researcher kind of as asking for borrowed time, borrowed stories. When I ask people to share something about their lives, I don't really have something to offer them at that point. So the best I can do is bring it back to them, so that it's not like I'm going around extracting people's stories and they continue not to have anything out of it. Through CIMPROC, the Center for Mediation, Peace, and Resolution of Conflict, the organization that is in Ecuador that I founded, we've done a number of workshops. In the Mennonite Church in Quito, for example, we did a series of workshops where we used the findings of the research, translated them to kind of very practical day-to-day things, and did trainings with refugees. Things like, try to make friends with local folks. If you are afraid to go to the state, here are a number of other resources that you can go to, and that's a way to get access to protection. And we also trained refugees themselves in conflict resolution skills, sort of informal community mediation. And because of the trust issues and power imbalances, it may be that a refugee doesn't feel like they have an equal enough playing field to negotiate directly with a landlord or an employer or something like that. But mediation, it can be a powerful tool to help equalize that a little bit. And a combination of a refugee mediator and an Ecuadorian mediator can help to reassure both sides of a sort of impartial hearing. And we found that that was quite effective. There were challenges, especially the fact that this is a mobile population. So some of the people that we trained then sort of had disappeared or moved on within a year. And so it was hard to sustain it over time. But those are some of the kinds of practical things that we can do with this information, and also trying to inform policymakers. I'll give a brief plug. I run a summer institute through the University of Massachusetts Boston and Flaxo, Ecuador, which is a university in Quito. And we're going to run an online version this summer called Conflict Transformation Across Borders. And the focus is bringing people from all over the world, professionals, students, et cetera, to learn about how to navigate post-migrant refugee conflicts, border conflicts, and in cross-national environmental conflicts. And it has a practical side. There's a component of proposing a new intervention that you might imagine, getting feedback on it. Some people have actually gotten funding on their proposals after they went through the program. And so if folks are interested, this is open to people anywhere. You don't have to be a UMass Boston or Flaxo student to do it. And in fact, plenty of people aren't students at all. We've had professionals from all over the world do it. So for those interested, feel free to check that out or contact me. And this would be a way of sort of diving in a bit more practical way and meeting some of the people doing it. We have a lot of high-level guest speakers as well. So I guess I'll close with that. Thanks for sharing your rainy day with me, and hopefully this was helpful.
Thank you so much. That was really great. And we're happy to pass along that flyer. You can email us after this and we'll figure that out. Thank you everyone for coming. And I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Okay. Yes, thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.